now it could be too late. You can't deny it, you can't deny it now. It's all up to the hand of fate. You better learn it before it's too late. You can't deny it, you can't defy it. All over the world is love. You can't deny it, you can't defy it. All over the world is love. All over the world is love. All over the whole wide world is love. All over the world is love. All over the whole wide world is love. When a sea of love meets a sea of hate, gotta get it together, gotta integrate.
Alright, hello there thrill seekers, and the song for today was called All Over the World is Love. And I wrote that song for Zero Defects. I was sort of imagining a scenario, sort of an alternate timeline scenario where Zero Defects had stayed together through the 80s and got signed to a major label and did the kind of thing that some other hardcore bands who got signed to major labels did, which is write a pop song and get on the radio. Loud Fast Rules did that. You guys know who Loud Fast Rules became, right? They signed to a major label and had some hits. There were a few other bands, Husker Du, I guess. Green Day wasn't really a hardcore band, were they? Anyway, that was the idea. A hardcore sort of a crossover pop song. And I imagined Jimmy Image doing the shouty bits, and then me and Mick, the drummer, and Jeff, the guitar player, doing the harmonies. I don't know, maybe it would have been good, but that's what that's about. And before I forget, I want to remind you that I will be on tour in Europe next month. It's August now, and in September I will be in Europe, and the dates are showing on your screen. I will be in Finland, Germany, France, England, and Belgium. And so if you want to know more about those tour dates, you can go to hardcorezen.info/events. That is hardcorezen.info/events. There you will find clickable links to get information about any of these events, and there are also non-clickable links in the description below this YouTube video. So I got a question, and I'm not going to say the line. You guys know where that line is from? Anyway, I'm not going to say the line. And it came from somebody on Twitter named Eric, and it goes like this. Oh wow, his Twitter handle is Compost Fetish. That's interesting. So tell me, Brad, what is your take on the Zen views of death? Everything dies, including the sun. Personally, I think everyone is wrong. Some are just more wrong than others. That's the question, and on the very same day that I received that question on Twitter, I got a question by email asking me about a chapter in Dogen's Shobogenzo called Shoji. And the translation I gave it in my book, It Came From Beyond Zen, is living and dying. Most people call it life and death, or some people call it birth and death. And for those of you who know Chinese characters, that's the Chinese characters in the title. I hope you can see that. It's really hard. I'm getting a lot of glare on the screen, so I don't know if you're seeing what I'm seeing. Anyway, Shoji, life and death. And in the 95 chapter, sort of complete Shobogenzo, it appears as chapter 92, so it's way at the end. And this is one of the chapters that Dogen did not record a date for, and it may or may not be complete. We don't know. These undated chapters, it's hard to know if Dogen actually considered them finished or not. Probably he didn't. But the chapter is about life and death, and it expresses somewhat of the Zen view of death. And the Zen view of death, as it turns out, like all Zen views of everything, is a little complicated, a little hard to understand. Most people that I encounter when they're asking me about the Zen view of death, what they're asking about is what they've heard in, on the Oprah Winfrey show or whatever, popular culture. They heard that it's reincarnation, that you die and then you get reincarnated as something else and all that, and maybe they know a little bit more than that, but that's basically what they mean. Well, if you read Dogen, it doesn't really come across quite that straightforward. So what I thought I would do is read you my version of Shoji, which comes, as I say in the book, It Came From Beyond Zen, which is 2 books ago for me. And here it goes. So remember, this is my paraphrase of it. This isn't exactly what Dogen said, and we'll talk about that at the end. But it's a really short chapter. In Dogen's own version, it's barely 2 pages in English, and in my version, it's even shorter. That's why I chose to read my version instead of Dogen's. And before I start, I should say that even though this chapter is often called Living and Dying, or Birth and Death, or Life and Death, the characters Shoji used to represent it are the characters that are used in Buddhism to represent samsara. So when I first started learning about Buddhism, and I didn't know nothing about Buddhism, my understanding initially was that nirvana was Buddhist heaven and samsara was Buddhist hell. That was the best I could do when I first encountered them. And that's not quite the case. Nirvana isn't quite like heaven, but it is what happens when you kind of reach the goal, let's say. I'm not even going to try to dig deep into whether there's a goal to reach or not, but let's just put it that way for now to save time. And samsara is this world, and including the various Buddhist hells would be included among samsara. But just to make things even more confusing for you, there are Buddhist heavens, multiple ones, which are also included in samsara. So me thinking nirvana is Buddhist heaven and samsara is Buddhist hell isn't quite wrong, because both Buddhist heaven and Buddhist hell are considered part of samsara, part of life and death, because in Buddhism you don't live forever in heaven. You live for maybe thousands or tens of thousands or millions of years in heaven, but then you die eventually, and then you're still in the cycle. So that's the way Buddhism goes. But the point I'm trying to make is that most people translate this chapter title as Living and Dying, Life and Death, Birth and Death, but it also means samsara. And very few translators mention that. In fact, even Nishijima Roshi, my teacher, doesn't mention that in his translation. I found it in Masao Abe's translation, and I was like, oh yeah, that's true. So I'm going to make some mention while I read this of the places where I think that Dogen is saying samsara as life and death rather than life and death. And also, just to make it even more complicated, the character for life and the character for birth are the same. So that comes up too. So let's just read the chapter. Because there's Buddha in life and death, there isn't any life and death. Because in life and death there isn't Buddha, so he's contradicting himself, you don't need to get confused about life and death. Master Kasan and Master Jozan said these things. These are quotes from those 2 guys. And they were pretty smart cookies who didn't just go around saying goofy stuff. If you want to get free from life and death, samsara, you gotta dig into what they said. If you're looking for Buddha outside of life and death, that's like going to McDonald's and expecting a nutritious meal, or putting on a Metallica album when you want to hear something soothing. Now, obviously, Dogen didn't mention McDonald's or Metallica, but he says it's like pointing a cart north and expecting to go south, or looking south and expecting to see the North Star, I think is what he says. He goes on. All you're doing is just collecting more of the causes of life and death, samsara, and losing any hope of getting free. When we understand that life and death, samsara, is itself nirvana, there's no such thing as life and death to be a hater of, and no such thing as nirvana to get all hot and bothered for. That's when you can start getting free of life and death, samsara. You're mistaken if you think we move from birth to death. Birth is a single moment that happens at the time of birth. It has its own past and its own future. That's why we Buddhists say birth isn't really birth, or appearance isn't really appearance. Death, too, is a single moment that happens at the time of death. It also has its own past and its own future. That's why we Buddhists say that disappearance isn't really disappearance, or death isn't really death. When you're alive, there's nothing but life. When you die, there's nothing but death. So when life comes, be alive. When death comes, die. You don't need to dodge either one, and you don't need to long for either one. Your own life and death are exactly the sacred life of Buddha. If you despise your real life and want to toss it aside, you're throwing away the sacred life of Buddha. On the other hand, if you grab onto your life like there's no tomorrow, that's another way to throw away the sacred life of Buddha. That's just you pretending to be Buddha. You only really get inside the mind of Buddha when you can stop wanting life and stop fearing death. But don't think about it and don't talk about it. Just let go of your body and forget your mind. Throw them into the house of Buddha. Then Buddha does it all. Follow this way and you become a Buddha without making any effort or coming up with any plan. Who would want to get stuck in their own mind? It's easy to become a Buddha. Don't be a jerk. Don't get hung up on life and death. Have compassion for everybody and everything. Show some respect for people who deserve it and kindness to people who need it. Don't get all caught up in hating stuff or in wanting stuff. Don't think too much. Don't worry. That's what we call being a Buddha. You don't need anything else. The end. So as I said, it's a short chapter, and one of the things that always strikes me when I read this chapter is that Nishijima Roshi, my teacher, you've heard me say this before, he quoted or paraphrased this a lot. He referenced this a lot. Anytime life and death would come up, anything somebody would ask about death or what happens after we die or whatever, he would say, when I'm alive, I'm just alive. When I die, I'll just die. And he was true to his word. He was on his deathbed, and the story I heard from somebody who was there at the time was that they were going to put him on a ventilator. I think they were going to, put one of those tubes down his throat so that he could live some more time. And he refused it, saying, I will decide when it's time for me to die. And thus saying, he lived a little while longer, and then he passed away. And so he wasn't afraid of death in the end, and I really admire that, and that's something I hope I'll be able to do when it's my time. Another thing he says, Dogen says in this, is that your own life here and now is the sacred life of Buddha. That is, I think, a really important teaching, because Buddha didn't present himself as a prophet or a special man or a savior or the son of God or anything like that. He was a human being, and he had the same kind of BS that you and I have to go through in life, and the same hassles and the same itches and the same, problems on the, I don't know what, whatever problems you have, he had them. It's sex problems, relationship problems, all the rest of it. And it was through this that he found nirvana, and that's important. So what Dogen is saying here is, if you hate your life and you're aiming for something else, some nirvana outside of this life, that's not the way to do it. You find nirvana in this life itself. Also, one of the things he said that I don't think I commented on this in the book when I said this. He talks about throwing everything into the house of Buddha and letting Buddha do it all. That's an interesting idea, because the Christians have a similar idea, that's, what do they say? Oh God, there's a phrase they say all the time. But anyway, they say, letting Jesus do it. What would Jesus do? And all this idea of letting the Lord take over. And it's a sort of a similar idea, but not quite the same, because there's no sort of image that you keep of Buddha and try to imagine what he would do. Well, you might do that, but that's not what he's talking about in this particular line. He's talking about kind of just giving up the idea of choice. I think I said this a few videos ago. There was a band back in the old hardcore punk days when Zero Defects was first together called PPG, and they had a song called Choice is Our Fate. And I liked that line because it sort of says choice may not be the greatest thing ever. And choice in Buddhism is often talked about as an illusion. the illusion of choice. This gets into a whole difficult discussion about free will versus determinism, and I don't really want to go there in a short video. But my short take on that, if you want to know Brad's opinion, is that we do have free will, but it's just a little bit. Now, we should use that little bit of free will we have wisely, but we should remember that most of the choices we seem to make are already made, and we don't really have to agonize that much about them. Just kind of go with the flow, as the hippies said, you know? Just kind of let things go and throw it into the house of Buddha. That's Dogen's advice. And of course, he didn't actually say don't be a jerk, but that phrase, don't be a jerk, which was the title of one of my books, is shoaku makusa in Japanese. I'm not sure if that's what he says in this chapter, but he says it in another passage that he wrote. Shoaku makusa means avoid doing wrong, or avoid doing wrongs in plural, and there's this whole thing I could go into about how Japanese doesn't have true plurals, but that's too much. But anyway, he's saying it in plural. Don't do wrongs. So the way that we do the right thing is by not enacting wrong, by not bringing wrong into the world. And that's one of his pieces of advice. He just says, you know, be a decent person. That's how you be a Buddha. Don't be a jerk. Don't get hung up on life and death. Have compassion for everybody and everything. Show some respect for people who deserve it and kindness to people who need it. Don't get all caught up in hating stuff or in wanting stuff. Don't think too much and don't worry. Those are his pieces of advice. So there's my take on the Buddhist views of death, which is, it's hard to when you talk about the Buddhist views of death, it's not real straightforward like most people want it to be. And it's more like when you're alive, you're alive. Death is something that has its own moment and its own past and its future, and in a sense, it's here right now. The moment that I recorded the song, the fake video for the song, All Over the World Is Love, that's gone, that's dead. The moment that I just talked about recording that video for the song is dead, it's gone. So death is happening every second, every nanosecond. But death in the sense of, you know, I fall over dead and there's little X's over my eyes and all that stuff, like in a cartoon. That's something else, and right now I'm alive, so be alive when it's time to be alive and leave death to itself. That's kind of the Buddhist view of death. So, if you want to support me from now and keep me from dying, you can go to the URL you're seeing on your screen below, which is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. There you will find links to my PayPal and Patreon accounts. Those are my main and usually only ways of making a living, and I appreciate your support. But, as always, you don't gotta donate if you don't want to donate, because I offer this for free. So we'll see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Laters. Hey Ziggy, you like it in here where it's cool instead of going out there where it's hot? Yeah. Alright. Well, stay cool. Talk to you later.